Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest tonight is Dr. Ken Hammond. He is the professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. Thank you so much for joining me, Ken.
Hey, very glad to be here.
So I actually was introduced to you recently. There was a video that someone had shared with me of you giving a basic lecture about the history of China. It was actually a series. It's on YouTube, but I think this was from like a couple of years ago. And I started watching that and I was like, I want to see if I can talk to Dr. Ken Hammond, because you seem obviously very knowledgeable about China. And this is a topic that I don't cover as much as I would like to on this show, because I don't know a lot of people that are really well knowledgeable about China, except for Danny Haifong. But I guess I want to get started with this issue with China and Taiwan. About last year, Nancy Pelosi and I want to say Ed Markey decided to make a visit to Taiwan, separate trips. And Taiwan, of course, has been fighting for some type of independence. And I'm curious about this because I was thinking about the one China policy. And why is it that Taiwan now all of a sudden wants to have some type of independence? And how do you feel this is going to affect China and U.S. relations going forward?
Well, the Taiwan question is really at the heart of the tensions between China and the United States right now. It's kind of the flashpoint. It's the major area that the United States has been focusing on in its sort of critical attitude towards China. The one China policy. I mean, it's not just a policy. There's one country. It's China, and Taiwan's part of it. And that's recognized on sort of both sides of the straits. China, the People's Republic of China on the mainland, of course, views Taiwan as a province that has a separate administration right now, but still is part of the country. And on the island, the administration there calls itself the Republic of China. If you buy a map in a bookstore in Taipei, the capital there, it'll show the whole country. It'll show just exactly the same things that are on a map you buy on the mainland. Both sides, say that they are the legitimate government of all of China. Obviously, they can't both be correct about that. But the one China policy is a policy that was agreed upon between the United States and the government of the People's Republic all the way back in 1972, when at that time President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to Beijing and Shanghai in February. And at the end of that, they issued something called the Shanghai Communique, in which, China stated its position, the United States stated its position, and the United States agreed that, there's one country, it's China, and Taiwan is part of it. And so that has been reiterated in a number of later agreements when the United States and the People's Republic established formal diplomatic relations in 1979. That was, of course, part of that agreement. The United States does not legally, officially recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan as the legitimate government. We have this bizarre relationship with the local government on Taiwan. But the official position of the United States is that there's only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. The situation now isn't really all that different than it has been for many years in terms of the actual position of Taiwan vis-a-vis the mainland. The position of the central government is that Taiwan has its own system, its own economic system, its own political system, its own local administration, but it's still part of the country. And they are committed to maintaining that. They have what's called the one country, two systems policy, which is the same thing that applies to the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. They have very separate administrative systems from that of the mainland. And, the same thing would be the case with Taiwan. The difference in the situation these days is that the United States, which has assumed a very aggressive position towards China, seeking to sort of contain China and roll back China's progress, the the United States is using Taiwan as a platform to stir up hostilities, to stir up tensions between, really between the United States and China, but they're trying to manipulate the situation in Taiwan to be part of that. Although in recent elections there, although the Democratic People's Party, the DPP, won the presidency, they didn't do so by a majority. They only did it by a small plurality. But the Kuomintang, which is a unification party, a party that recognizes that it's all one country, they won the majority in the legislature, and so the situation, the political situation on the island is very complicated. No one there officially advocates independence. That would be crossing a red line with China, with the mainland government. But the DPP is seeking to promote a more sort of de facto independent status. And that's really what underpins a lot of the tensions right now.
Very interesting. It does seem like obviously the U.S. is on the side of Taiwan. At least that's what our politicians have said. There's been a lot of fear mongering from our politicians about China. And it doesn't matter if it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I've seen both parties fear monger about China. Why do you believe that is? They tend to refer to China as communists, and they tend to use that Red Scare threat, I think, to scare people away. But what do you think the real underlying meaning is for the fact that the U.S. government tends to fearmonger people about China?
Well, the policies directed towards China, the practices that the American government carries out, whether it's sending military assistance and weapons and troops to Taiwan, or provoking China in the South China Sea, or demonizing China with these claims about Hong Kong or about Xinjiang, sort of presenting China as this authoritarian, dictatorial society. These are all measures that are designed to promote an anti-China consciousness amongst the American people. The United States, the political elites in the United States, and you're quite right, on both sides of the mainstream political divide, the Republicans, the Democrats, doesn't matter. They fear China. They do fear China. They fear China's reemergence as a significant economy, as a significant political participant in global affairs, because they see that as undermining the power and the privileges which they have possessed, which they've held for many, many, many years, certainly since the end of the Second World War. And they don't want to surrender. They don't want to give up their position as the dominant power in the world. But China's rise is only part of a larger sort of global reconfiguration in which we're moving from a kind of unipolar world, a world where the U.S. has assumed for itself the right and the power to direct things all over, to be the hegemonic power on the planet. We're moving away from that. That period is over, to one of a sort of multi-centric world. It's not just China, but India, Brazil, South Africa, a number of countries are becoming increasingly important. They're having their own economic development, their own trajectories of modernization. And the United States hates that. The United States elites, they want to hold on to the power and the perks that they enjoy. So they fear China's rise. They fear the changes that are taking place in the world. And they want the American people, even though that's no threat to the American people, they want the American people to fear China, rather than seeking ways in which the United States and China could work together to solve really big, fundamental, existential questions like climate change, poverty, racism, and injustice. There's all these things that we all know are wrong, are terrible out there in the world. But instead of focusing on those, the elites in America are focusing on maintaining their own privileged positions.
Well said. And I think back to a point in this country where we did have majority manufacturing in this country. So we're going back many decades. And I feel like if the U.S. wanted to remain in that position, I think one of the worst things that they did was to send jobs to China. So we have to remember that it's like the U.S. government is trying to punish China for being economically, a competitor of the United States. but they kind of opened that door when they decided to send jobs overseas because they wanted to find ways to make more money and have cheaper labor. So it's almost like China is being punished because of that. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I don't know why this is doing this. Sorry.
I think you're absolutely right about that. China's being punished for being successful at doing exactly what the United States encouraged them to do, except for the fact that China does it in its own way. China does it in a way that's very different from the United States. The United States is, at this point, the classical late capitalist economy where, a small elite of wealthy, powerful people who own, the high ground in the economy are making money. The inequality in the American economy, the redistribution up of wealth produced by working people into the hands of this little elite, that has only accelerated in recent decades. And, we are becoming an increasingly dysfunctional, fragmented, and unequal society. Because we have this capitalist system that has to grow, has to enhance its wealth, has to accumulate capital in the hands of a few, in contrast to China, which has not yet, of course, become a great full socialist society, but is on that path. They're accumulating social wealth in ways that have allowed them in recent years to address problems like the 2008 financial crisis, like the COVID pandemic, so, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, beginning to address their climate change problems, which are, of course, part of global problems. So China has a system, a social, economic, political system that is very different from that of the United States. And so, that antagonism is also based on a fear that China's success can potentially become a model that other countries will seek to emulate, and that they will turn away also from the global sort of capitalist system and try to look for alternatives. And that too is seen as threatening by, basically by the capitalist elite in the United States.
When I worked at Boston University, I was an academic advisor, and most of my students were from China, and they weren't interested. Most of them were not interested in getting a job in the United States after graduation. They said, well, no, I can go back home to China and easily get a job because I have a degree from the United States. And they told me that, a lot of them experienced culture shock the first time coming to the US, because that was the first time a lot of them had actually seen so many homeless people.
Yeah.
And so I learned some of these things from them. They explained to me, we don't really have this as an issue in China. So somehow China found a way to start to weed out homelessness as well.
Well, that's a fundamental difference, and I agree. When people from China come to the United States and they see, if they're in any real big cities, even in small cities like mine, I live in a little town in southern New Mexico, and we have issues with homelessness here, although we are, there's a lot of very good work being done around that here. But homelessness is an absurd issue. How on earth can American society, which, our politicians constantly tell us about how it's, we're the best country in the world and the richest country in the world and all this, and yet we have hundreds of thousands of people who don't even have a place to sleep at night. They're on the streets, they're in shelters. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And that simply does not exist in China. In China, as part of their socialist infrastructure, every citizen, everybody who lives there has what's called a household registration. And what that means is that when they need a place to be, they have a place to be. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody is living where they have their household registration, because people are free to move around. People can go different places to seek employment, seek better opportunities. And millions and millions and millions of people in China do that. But if we look back, for example, to 2008, 2009, when we had this global financial crisis, that really hurt China. Consumer demand in the West just evaporated because, capitalists had ramped up all these speculative financial devices, and those came crashing down. And people lost their homes, people lost their jobs. A lot of people still haven't recovered from that in America. That had an effect in China as well, because 20 million people, well, even maybe a little more than that, lost their jobs in China because consumer demand in the West went away. They simply weren't buying things that were being made in China. Those 20 million people, if that was the United States, as we saw during the crisis, millions of people who were displaced here wound up, without jobs, living on welfare, maybe many of them, out on the streets. But in China, every single one of those people had a household registration back where they had originally lived. Mostly, they came from villages scattered around in central China, western China, and they could go home. They could go back there. And the system there guaranteed them housing. It guaranteed them educational opportunity for their children. It guaranteed them health care. They weren't living the life of Riley. It's not to say that they went back and they were living high on the hog. These were basic services, but they were just that. They were basic services, and people had places to go back to. And so they weathered that storm in a way that was so much easier, so much better for them. And within a year, most of them were back in employment. The government redirected a lot of resources towards domestic consumption so that they weren't quite so dependent on the export economy. And people either got jobs back in the factories that they had been working in or found new places of employment, so that by the end of a year and a half, those 20 million people had been taken care of in the interim and were then getting back into employment. A very, very different experience than what we had in the United States. Homelessness in China is just not something that they would tolerate or they would accept, because it's a society, it's a system that is focused on taking care of the needs of people, just as we saw during the pandemic when China took an economic hit. China, suffered economically from the fact that they devoted so much of their resources, so much of their care to making sure that people didn't die. And so China lost a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people that we lost. What did we lose? 1.1 million people died in America during the pandemic. In China, even after the relaxation of their controls, fewer than 60,000 people have died, and they have a population 4 times bigger than ours. So the prioritization of the needs of the people means that something like homelessness and something like having over 1 million people die from a needless thing, that just doesn't happen in China.
It's amazing. And one of the things I've pointed out to people before, if we look at the top banks in the world, because this wasn't always this way. If we look at just even the top 5 banks, so they have the previous rank and they have the current rank. The top 5 banks: Industrial and Commercial Bank of China Limited, China Construction Bank Corporation, Agricultural Bank of China Limited, Bank of China Limited, and then you get to the First American Bank, which is JP Morgan and Chase. It's really interesting because you'll see in the top 5 banks in the world, China has 4 in the top 5. And what I want people to understand is, like, it wasn't always this way. And this is one of the reasons why I wonder if this is what a lot of the politicians are really upset about, and not so much China is this big, red, scary, country that we all need to be afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, the American people don't need to be afraid of China. A friend of mine was sort of joking with me recently and saying, people are so afraid of China. What would happen? He said, if China, came and somehow took over the United States. And I said, well, first thing they do would build a national network of high-speed rail. I mean, you look at what actually goes on in China, the improvements that have taken place in the lives of the people, the level of technological sophistication and advancement, the things that they're doing, to try to combat climate change and all this. It's so different from the image that most Americans have in their heads, which is fed by the daily propaganda coming out of Washington and out of our media. It's a different world. And yes, it's based upon China's very success. What you said earlier is absolutely right. China's being punished for being successful. But I think the key to that, the reason that they're being punished for being successful, is that for a while, certainly from maybe the end of the 1970s on down until maybe 10, 15 years ago, the American elites believed, they thought, they expected, so they certainly hoped, that China would go through a change, that it would abandon its socialist system, and it would just simply become another capitalist country, and it would become yet another subordinate component of the American dominated global system, right? And they thought that that was sort of inevitable, that if China developed economically, that of course, it would go through this kind of change. But I think it was after the 2008 crisis, after the financial crisis, when they saw how China dealt with that, and they realized that China was actually serious about this project of trying to build a socialist society and economy. That's when President Obama announces the what he called the pivot to Asia, and Secretary of State Clinton at that time wrote an article about how America needed to launch a new Pacific century, and then President Trump with the tariff wars, and now the Democrats in the White House, Joe Biden, is just as anti-China as anybody. So, they're across the spectrum of the mainstream parties. They are united in their hostility towards China. The only question is, who's going to be tougher on China, right? And that's not helpful. That's not useful. It's not in the interest of the American people. Just again on this idea of trying to deal with the environmental crisis. China produces the most efficient and the lowest cost solar panels, solar electric panels in the world. They've devoted tremendous research and development to that, and they make great solar panels, and they're very inexpensive. But Americans can't have access to those. The American government, the American political elites would rather slow the process of the adoption of solar energy in the United States than allow China to send those panels over here, to sell those panels over here. When Janet Yellen, was just in China, and she lectured the Chinese, she gave them a hard time. They're saying that they had developed excessive capacity, overcapacity in things like electric vehicles and solar panels. Well, we're facing this massive crisis of the planet. We should be devoting everything we can to developing electric vehicles, to developing solar energy, and to sort of wag the finger at China and say, you're doing too much in this area, when we're banning the import of these products that could help us address these issues. It's self-destructive. It's a futile gesture on the one hand, but it's also self-destructive for America's own interests.
And I feel like we also need China. So when I hear politicians, threaten that, whoa, we need to take out China, I'm like, don't we need China in reference to manufacturing and production? Like, what would we do if China wasn't around? Because we don't manufacture as much as we used to in this country.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, anybody whoever shops at Walmart knows that without China, a lot of those shelves would be bare. There's a lot of things. They're restricting some of the goods that China can export to the United States, but there's still this vast array of goods that are manufactured in China, produced in China, whether it's your cell phone or your sneakers or whatever it might be. I mean, that's just the nature of the global economy today. American capital, Western capital in general, because of the crises that they got themselves into in the 1970s, they had to find a way to lower labor costs, lower the cost of labor inputs in the production process. So they were looking to ship jobs wherever they could, whether that was Mexico or Bangladesh or China. And China's a huge country with a very, sophisticated working class. And so, a lot of that money went to China to develop productive capacity there. And that's had a hollowing out effect on our economy. It's not China's fault. Those were decisions that were made in the corporate boardrooms and the banking centers of American capitalism. And now, that allowed China to pursue its own economic takeoff. And now their economy, by some measures, is even bigger than ours. Now, their country, their population is 4 times the size of ours, so it's going to keep growing. It's going to get bigger and bigger. Someday, their economy is going to dwarf the American economy because they're good at what they do. They're good at making things. They're good at innovation, creativity. All the things that America, supposedly values. They're doing it better now. And that's driving us crazy. That's driving the political and economic elites here crazy. I think you're quite right that's China's success is not the result of America, but it certainly has been desired, or was being desired by America. And now that they've achieved so much and they're going on to achieve so much more, suddenly, because they won't play the game our way, we're like, oh, they're bad, and we've got to stop them. They're a threat, but they're not a threat to the American people. They may be a threat to the privileges and the special powers of the American elites, but they're not a threat to the American people. And it's just crazy for those politicians to try to paint China in such scary sort of demonized colors.
And that brings me to BRICS. We are seeing more countries choose to fill out an application to join BRICS. Every time I turn around, it seems like it's another country that wants to join. But China, obviously, a huge part of BRICS. What do you predict for the future globally for a country like China and this idea of a multipolar world? And what does that mean for the United States? Because I see us actually being outside of that bubble. I don't see the United States trying to join a multipolar world.
Well, the whole point, of course, of the multipolar development, the way that things are trending, and these are really deep structural changes. This isn't just a few sort of ideas or decisions being made. These are things that are happening largely because the monopoly that the West had for a century and a half, basically, on advanced industrial technologies and productive capacities, that monopoly broke. And now, places like China or Brazil or Indonesia or Malaysia, countries in Africa, South Africa, and others, these are countries that are advancing themselves, and that's what's creating this multipolar world. But a component of that for many countries is their desire to be out from under the domination of the United States. The United States would like to, hold on. They'd like to continue to control basically as much of the world as they can. They were capable of that for a long time, but that's no longer going to be the case. So this emergence of a multipolar system, China is obviously, it's going to be a big component of that. It's this huge economy. It's a huge population. They're going to play a major role in that. But BRICS it's not an organization that China runs or China controls. China is one member. India is another, just as big, now a slightly bigger population, not as developed, not as prosperous as China, but still going to be very important. Russia, China, Brazil, all these countries, South Africa, and now these new members coming in. This is creating a system that hopefully is going to be independent of the domination of the United States. And we see a lot of measures about this, efforts to find new ways to settle international transactions. Instead of all that being controlled and having to flow through the banks in New York, now, a lot of that is being settled directly between countries in their own currencies. A lot of that in the Chinese currency, but others, like Russia's been selling a lot of energy materials to India for payment in rubles or in rupees, and that's getting out from under the domination of the dollar. And as that happens, again, it undermines it reduces the power, the influence of the United States in the world. But from the perspective of the vast majority of people in the world, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
And I'm thinking the more countries that join BRICS, what is the U.S. going to do? They can't go to war with everyone.
Certainly true. They do, of course, if a country, starts to become too independent of the United States, is no longer deferential to the United States. Think of the coup that took place in Bolivia a couple of years ago that was, manipulated by the United States. The taking down of Imran Khan in Pakistan recently. He was, certainly not a a great fan of China or something like that. They had a workable relationship, but he refused to subordinate Pakistan to American guidance, to domination. One of the American senior officials in the State Department was exposed as having talked about how, well, he's got to go because he won't play the game our way. And the next thing you know, he's taken down. Now he's been imprisoned and demonized, even though his party won the recent elections there by a significant margin. So, the United States is going to do what it can to slow down, to disrupt this process of the emergence of a multipolar order. But it's a fool's errand. It's not going to work because these are, as I say, these are deep structural changes far beyond what politicians say and do and the kind of policies they put into place. You can't, in a sense, to use an overused metaphor, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. This stuff is going forward regardless of what American political elites try to do. But rather than try to figure out how to work with this process and find ways that will be more beneficial to the American people, they're trying to hold on to this kind of now isolationist, my way or the highway attitude that's counterproductive and alienates many of these countries that otherwise might have remained more friendly to the U.S. But when they see how the United States is conducting itself, they stand off and they're like, whoa, this is not a good thing, and we don't want to be part of this.
Well said. And in reference to this war with Russia and Ukraine, I look at it as though Russia is China's neighbor. If I'm guessing, if China if they were pushed to take a side, they would probably take Russia's side because they're a part of BRICS. And I just feel like the Biden administration is pushing us closer and closer to World War III. If it's not Israel and Gaza, it's Russia and Ukraine. Now, Iran is in the mix, and it's a very scary time, I think, for people that are paying attention to geopolitics. And I just wonder if it's going to get to that point, if it is going to escalate to a point where China feels they have to get involved, or if the Biden administration is going to try to take us into a further conflict with China.
Well, I think that whether it's Biden or Trump that gets elected in November, the policies of the American government towards China are unlikely to change, and they're very dangerous. They're very reckless, and they do seriously risk actual military conflict, which would be devastating both materially and economically, certainly to Taiwan, significant damage probably to China. That would have a very disruptive effect on the American economy. It would be a disaster for working people in America. But they seem to disregard the seriousness of that kind of threat. The situation with Russia and China is one. Russia and China have very, very different economic and political systems. Russia is certainly not any kind of a socialist society. It has these oligarchs. It has its own way of going about doing things. But Russia and China, as you say, are neighbors. They share a long border. Their economies are highly integrated with one another. They do a lot of trade. There's a lot of resources that pass back and forth between them. And, they also share the desire not to be dominated by the United States and the West. Russia's conflict with Ukraine grows out of the relentless expansion of NATO, this pushing of American-dominated NATO up against Russia's borders. And Russia said over and over and over again, don't do this. Don't do this. We can't accept this. And when, U.S. and NATO went ahead, well, Russia didn't accept it, So, the idea that somehow Russia is the demon here, that's based again on a kind of inversion of the actual history, the actual developments that have taken place. And now, right now, I was listening to news earlier today and to Biden's, macho strutting about Iran. What's amazing is this seems to be such a cynical ploy to divert attention from what Israel is doing in Gaza, from the genocide that the IDF is carrying out in Gaza. Now, suddenly, we have to worry about the boogeyman of Iran, even though there's no conflict taking place there. I mean, Israel, bombed the Iranian embassy in Beirut and killed senior Iranian leaders. And Iran has said somebody's going to have to pay a price for this. That's a rhetorical gesture. There may be something that's going to happen. But this idea that suddenly all the news media are going to pay attention to, the Iran-Israel conflict, rather than, talking about the genocide that's going on every single day, tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of whom are just children, being killed by the IDF, in this relentless campaign to destroy a Palestinian society and any possibility of a Palestinian state. It's so cynical. It's so manipulative. It just makes you want to, I don't know, tear your hair out or something. But it's something that the Biden administration is going forward with, just as Joe Biden has been a relentless supporter of Israel, a relentless supporter of this genocide in Gaza, and yet tries to present himself as some sort of democratic friend of the people. He's not a friend of the people of Gaza. He's not a friend of the Palestinian people, and he's not a friend of the American people.
That's right. One more question for you, Ken. I was reading that you went to Kent State, I believe, during the time when there were protests at Kent State. I just want to pick your brain about this in reference to direct action in this country. I read somewhere that we need 5% of the population to actually create a mass movement in this country, whether it's over class issues, whether it's over the war in Gaza, etc. What do you feel is different when you look at direct action and protests today compared to, back then with Kent State, et cetera, because you guys didn't have social media back then. And it drives me crazy a little bit, because I know because we have social media, we can increase our numbers. But it seems like I look back at videos from decades ago and you guys were able to get hundreds and thousands of people out in the street and you didn't have social media. So I'm just curious, how do you feel about creating movements in this country compared to decades ago?
Well, I mean, in the 60s, especially the second half of the 60s, the crises that we were facing in the United States kind of came together in some interesting ways. You had the Black liberation struggle, you had the resistance to the war in Vietnam, you had anti-poverty struggles in many of the cities all across the country, and those things reinforced each other. And you had a lot of young people who had like myself, who had been raised in this expectation, this vision of the United States, this sort of, a 50s TV vision of everybody being, one big happy group hug. And as we matured, as we got into college and things like that, and as we saw what was happening in the country and what the United States was doing in Vietnam and in the Caribbean and things like that, and the repression that was being brought down against movements like the Black Panther Party and the spontaneous rebellions in cities like Newark and Cleveland and Detroit, our consciousness was forcibly raised. And I think that generated a mass movement. As you say, you need a significant chunk of people. You don't need a vast majority, but you need enough people to be in the streets, to be doing the work of building organizations, of fighting for the things that they believed in. These days, I think that our movement is growing. I think that more and more people are seeing the problems. There's no shortage of contradictions, no shortage of problems. We still have this horrible racism in our country, poverty in our country that's only gotten worse, inequality that's only getting worse day by day. We are involved in these wars overseas, mostly by proxy, but we are the power that's driving all this conflict in the world, whether it's Ukraine or Syria or, the horrible destruction that we inflicted on Iraq and Afghanistan, our engagements in Africa, our engagements in Latin America. We are the American government and the American military. We are the biggest problem in terms of the safety of people on the planet, in that sense, in history. And so, there are plenty of issues. There's no shortage of issues. And people are mobilizing. People are activists around these. What we need is a unifying force that brings lots of these disparate movements for gay rights, movements for women's liberation, movements for for union organizing, movements for the environment. We need something that draws those all together into a common cause, into a common force. And I think that there are people working towards that. I'm involved, with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and that's an objective that we have. We're by no means the only group doing that kind of stuff, but I think that's what was at the heart of the '60s. That whether it was Black liberation or anti-war or anti-poverty or movements for various kinds of social justice, we understood and we argued that you couldn't solve those problems one by one. You couldn't solve them in isolation from one another. You needed a systemic critique. The problem was capitalism. The problem was, the system that dominated the country. And to solve these problems, we need to change the system. And there's more and more people now who are understanding that, who are organizing around that. But that's the kind of thing we need to build. Social media is a great vehicle for doing that, but people in the streets, people organizing, people building their movements, that's what has to come together. But I do feel optimistic that those things are happening, and that we just need to keep doing the work.
I hear you. Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye now.
All right, guys, that was Dr. Ken Hammond. He is very well versed about China. He is a professor at New Mexico State University. Check him out on YouTube. There's a number of videos of Dr. Hammond giving lectures about China. That's actually how I found out about him. I saw a video of him giving a lecture about the history of China. So definitely check that out. Really informational there.